The moment I said I would represent myself, my in-laws laughed out loud. And in that instant, I understood something terrifying and simple. They already thought my life was over. The courtroom in Fort Worth felt colder than it should have been that morning. Not because of the air conditioning, but because every set of eyes in the room seemed fixed on me with the same quiet judgment. I sat alone at the defendant table with my hands folded on top of a worn leather briefcase. The kind you keep long after you can afford better, because it has survived things you have not. Across the aisle, my wife Rachel sat between her parents like she was back in grade school waiting for a teacher to scold someone else. Thomas Caldwell leaned back with his arms crossed. Perfectly tailored suit, silver hair combed neatly into place. Margaret Caldwell sat upright beside him, pearls resting against a crisp blouse, chin lifted just enough to signal that this room was familiar territory for her. They had brought an entire legal team. I had brought myself. The clerk called the case, my name and Rachel's name echoing through the chamber. I stood when instructed, nodded to the judge, then sat again. The judge was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, calm eyes, voice steady. He asked for appearances. Rachel's attorney spoke first, smooth and confident, listing his firm, his credentials, the representation of the petitioner. When it was my turn, I stood and said I was appearing on my own behalf. The sound that followed was not subtle. Thomas Caldwell laughed. Not a chuckle, not a polite exhale, but a sharp bark of amusement that bounced off the wooden benches. He leaned toward Margaret and said something under his breath, but not quiet enough. A man on the edge of bankruptcy cannot even afford a lawyer. A couple of people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Someone snorted. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes forward, fixed on the seal behind the judge. I could feel heat creeping up my neck, but I stayed still. This was not the first time Thomas had laughed at me. It was just the first time he had done it in public, in a place where he believed it mattered. Rachel did not look at me either. Her head was bowed, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped in her lap. From a distance, she looked fragile, wounded, like someone who had been wronged. I had seen that posture before. I knew how carefully it had been practiced. The judge cleared his throat. He glanced from Rachel's attorneys to me, then back again. "Mr. Harper," he said, "I want to make sure you understand your rights. You are entitled to counsel. If you need time to retain an attorney, the court can grant a continuance." For the first time, I turned my head slightly, not toward Thomas, not toward Rachel, but toward the judge. I met his eyes and shook my head once. "I am ready to proceed today." There was a pause, heavy and deliberate. The judge studied my face, maybe looking for panic, maybe looking for arrogance. Whatever he saw, he nodded. "Very well," as I sat back down. Thomas let out a breath that sounded almost like disappointment. He had wanted me to hesitate. He had wanted me to look small. If anyone had asked me in that moment why I came alone, I would have told them the simple version. Because I could not afford a lawyer. Because I was stubborn. Because I thought I was smarter than everyone else in the room. The truth was longer. I met Rachel more than a decade earlier, when my company was still a couple of trucks and a rented office outside Plano. Harper Freight Solutions was my pride and my obsession. I worked 14-hour days, slept on a couch more nights than I care to admit, and believed that if I just kept pushing, everything would eventually fall into place. Rachel admired that at first, or at least she said she did. Her parents were polite when we were introduced, but distant, like they were already calculating how long this phase of her life would last. Thomas ran an investment group that specialized in private equity. Margaret had inherited money and managed it like a general commands an army. They lived in a world where success was assumed, not earned. From the beginning, I was the outsider, the son-in-law who built something with his hands instead of inheriting it. Thomas liked to ask questions at dinner that sounded harmless until you heard the edge underneath. How much revenue are you doing now? Daniel, do you think that growth is sustainable? Have you considered selling before the market turns on you? I learned early to smile and deflect. To tell myself it was curiosity, not contempt. I told myself that a lot. Rachel and I married anyway. We had a daughter, Emily, and for a while, that was enough to drown out the noise. But somewhere along the way, the questions shifted. Rachel wanted to help with finances. She said it made sense with her background. She said it would protect our future, protect Emily. I let her. That decision would take me years to fully understand. By the time the first strange transfer appeared in our joint account, I was already stretched thin. Fuel costs were up. Clients were slow to pay. Rachel assured me it was nothing. A temporary move, a smart allocation. Her father had suggested it. Thomas always suggested things. When the transfers grew larger, I noticed. When property documents appeared for signatures, I did not remember discussing. I noticed that too. But every time I raised a question, the answer came wrapped in concern. You are stressed. You are tired. Let us handle this. And I did. Because I wanted my daughter to grow up in a whole home. Because I did not want to be the man who failed twice. The night Rachel told me she wanted a divorce, she was calm, prepared. Her parents were already on the phone with attorneys. By morning, accounts were moving, assets shifting, and I understood exactly how long this had been planned. I did not confront her. I did not threaten. I did not hire a lawyer. I started copying everything. Every statement, every email, every document she slid across the table with a soft smile and a pen. I signed what she asked me to sign, then photographed it the moment she left the room. I called a forensic accountant I trusted and asked him not to ask questions. I watched my reputation take hits. I watched partners step back. I watched Thomas Caldwell look more relaxed every time we crossed paths. He thought I was unraveling, sitting in that courtroom, listening to him laugh. I knew he believed the ending had already been written. That I was the failed businessman clinging to scraps while his family closed in to finish the job. The judge signaled for Rachel's attorney to begin. Papers shuffled, voices lowered. The machinery of the court started to turn. I placed my hand on the briefcase at my feet and felt the weight of what was inside. Not just documents, but months of silence, of restraint, of letting people underestimate me. I took a slow breath and reminded myself of one thing. They thought I came alone because I had nothing left. They had no idea why I really came alone, or what I had been waiting to say. I stood when the judge nodded in my direction, stepped forward, and opened the briefcase for the first time as the room fell quiet. The bailiff took the documents from my hands, stacked them neatly, and carried them toward the bench while the room stayed quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural. As I stepped back from the podium, my mind drifted to the first time I realized I could not trust the people sitting across from me. It was years earlier, long before courtrooms and subpoenas, back when Rachel and I still shared morning coffee at the kitchen counter and argued about paint colors instead of bank transfers. Harper Freight Solutions was growing then, not exploding, but steady enough that I could finally breathe. We had moved into a modest house in Plano. Nothing flashy, but ours. I believed we were building something together. Rachel came from a different world. Her parents lived in a gated community outside Dallas, the kind where the driveways curved just enough to hide the houses from the road. Thomas Caldwell liked to remind people of his success without ever listing numbers. He spoke in confidence, not facts. Margaret followed his lead, smiling politely while tracking every reaction in the room. At first, they treated me like a project, the promising son-in-law who needed guidance. Thomas asked about my margins, my debt structure, my growth strategy. I answered honestly, sometimes proudly. I wanted his approval more than I cared to admit. Rachel suggested she help with our finances after Emily was born. She said it made sense since I was buried in work and she had a sharper eye for details. I told myself it was partnership. I told myself that was what marriage looked like when it worked. The first transfer I questioned was small. $10,000 moved from our joint account into an investment fund tied to her father. Rachel explained it calmly. Short-term placement. Better yield than leaving it idle. Her father had done this for years. I nodded and let it go. The next one was larger. 50,000. Then 80. Each time. The explanation came wrapped in reassurance. I was tired. I was stressed. I needed to trust her. By the time I noticed documents appearing for signatures that I did not remember discussing, my instincts were screaming. But my pride kept me quiet. I did not want to be the man who questioned his wife about money in front of her parents. I did not want to look insecure. Thomas watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. At dinners, he would clap me on the shoulder and tell me I was doing the right thing by letting Rachel handle things. He said delegation was a sign of maturity. Margaret would nod and add that family should look out for family. Somewhere in that blur of good intentions and subtle pressure, I handed over control inch by inch. The night Rachel told me she wanted a divorce, there was no shouting, no slammed doors. She sat at the table, hands folded, voice steady. She said we had grown apart. She said it was better for Emily if we stayed civil. What she did not say was that her parents already had attorneys lined up. She did not say that accounts were already being repositioned. She did not say that my role in the story had already been rewritten. The morning after she moved out, I logged into our accounts and felt my stomach drop. Transfers pending, ownership titles updated, numbers moving with a speed that made no sense unless they had been planned. I drove to my office and sat alone in the parking lot longer than I cared to admit. I could hear Thomas's voice in my head, calm and confident, explaining how these things worked, how this was just business. That was the moment I stopped reacting and started observing. I did not confront Rachel. I did not call a lawyer. I did not raise my voice. I told her I understood and that I wanted this to be as smooth as possible for Emily. She seemed relieved. That relief told me everything. I began copying everything. Statements, emails, contracts. I backed them up in places no one else knew about. When Rachel brought documents for signature, I signed them without hesitation, then photographed every page after she left the room. I noted dates, times, account numbers. At the same time, my business started to feel the ripple effects. Clients delayed payments. A major partner asked for reassurances I could not give without revealing what I knew. Kevin Brooks, a man I had worked alongside for years, stopped returning my calls. He later told me he had heard things, that I was overextended, that the Caldwell name carried weight he could not ignore. I let it happen. I let Thomas believe his plan was working. I let Margaret send polite emails about protecting family assets. I let Rachel play the role of concerned mother, trying to shield her child from a failing husband. Every instinct in me wanted to fight back immediately, to expose everything, to clear my name. But I had learned something the hard way years earlier, after a failed partnership nearly ruined me. Timing mattered more than truth alone. That was when I called Michael Reeves. Michael was a forensic accountant I had worked with briefly after that old partnership collapsed. He was quiet, precise, and allergic to drama. When I told him I needed help reviewing transactions tied to my marriage, he did not ask why. He asked for access. We met late at night in his office, going over spreadsheets line by line. He did not react when he found irregularities. He just marked them. Patterns emerged. Transfers timed around legal milestones. Funds moving through entities that existed on paper and nowhere else. When Michael looked up at me and said this was not sloppy, this was deliberate, I felt a strange calm settle over me. That calm followed me into the courtroom in Fort Worth, standing there now, watching the judge flip through the first stack of papers I had submitted. I felt Thomas's gaze on the side of my face. He was not smiling anymore. Margaret's posture had stiffened. Rachel's hands were clenched in her lap. The judge asked Rachel's attorney to respond. The man stood and spoke confidently about marital rights and routine financial management. He gestured toward me once, briefly, as if I were an inconvenience. I waited. I had learned patience the hard way. When the judge turned back to me and asked if I had anything further at this time, I nodded and said yes. I had additional documentation related to property transfers. That was when Thomas shifted in his seat. He leaned forward, whispering sharply to Margaret. Rachel finally looked up at me, her eyes searching my face for something she could recognize. She did not find it. As I handed the next folder to the bailiff, I caught the faintest flicker of doubt pass across her expression. It was gone almost instantly, replaced by composure, but I had seen it. The judge announced a brief pause to review the materials. He did not look pleased or displeased. He looked focused. As everyone settled back into their seats, the room filled with the low hum of restrained conversation. I sat quietly, hands resting on the briefcase that was now lighter by one folder. This was still the surface layer, the part they expected me to have, the part they believed they could explain away. What they did not know was that every document I had shown so far was only there to prepare the ground. I watched Thomas straighten his cuffs, already rehearsing how this would end. I watched Margaret whisper reassurances to Rachel, reminding her to keep her head down. I stared straight ahead and counted my breaths, because the real reason I had come alone had nothing to do with money or pride. I had come alone so that when the moment arrived, there would be no one between me and the truth I was about to put on that bench. The pause the judge called felt brief on the surface, but inside my head, it stretched into a slow rewind of everything I had done to reach that chair. While the attorneys whispered and the bailiff stood watch, I sat still and let my thoughts return to the months when silence became my second job. After Rachel moved out, the house felt hollow. Emily's room stayed the same. Toys lined up, drawings taped to the wall, like proof that something good still existed there. Every night after she went to bed, I opened my laptop and worked through account statements the way I used to work through freight schedules, line by line, date by date. Nothing flashy, just discipline. I learned quickly that panic is expensive. Panic makes you confront too early. Panic makes you reveal what you know before it matters. I had made that mistake once before in my life, years back, when a business partner cut corners and I reacted emotionally instead of methodically. I paid for it then. I was not going to pay again. Michael Reeves taught me how to slow everything down. We met at his office off a side road in Irving, a place so forgettable no one ever lingered there. Michael never wasted words. He would sit with a legal pad, glasses low on his nose, and listen while I explained what I had noticed. Then he would ask for files, bank statements, transfer confirmations, ownership records. The first night, we worked until past midnight. He did not react to the numbers. He just circled them. When I asked what he thought, he told me it was too early to think anything. We needed patterns. Patterns take time, so I kept playing my part. I let Rachel believe I was overwhelmed. when she brought over paperwork for Emily's school expenses or property adjustments. I signed without hesitation. I even thanked her for handling things. That seemed to make her more confident. Confidence makes people sloppy. At the same time, my business started to bleed quietly. Harper Freight Solutions had always survived on tight margins. But suddenly credit tightened. A regional fuel supplier demanded shorter payment terms. A longtime client delayed renewing a contract. Kevin Brooks stopped answering my calls entirely. I heard through a mutual contact that Thomas Caldwell had been talking. Not directly. He never did anything directly. He asked questions at charity events. He expressed concern in boardrooms. He wondered aloud whether my company was stable enough to handle future volume. People listened. There is a specific kind of humiliation that comes from watching your name become a cautionary tale. Not because you failed, but because someone else is rewriting the narrative while you stay quiet. Every instinct told me to defend myself. Every night, I chose not to. Michael started finding the patterns around month 3, transfers that aligned with legal consultations. Money moving in and out of holding companies that had no operational footprint. Assets retitled in ways that made sense only if someone was preparing for a legal split. None of it was obvious on its own. Together, it painted a picture that was hard to ignore. He told me this was not impulsive behavior. This was planning. The hardest part was Emily. Rachel pushed for more overnights during the week, citing my work schedule. I agreed. I could not risk looking uncooperative. Every time I watched Emily walk back to her mother's car, my chest tightened. I reminded myself why I was doing this. The day I almost broke came when I found out the house in Plano had been quietly transferred into an entity tied to Caldwell Capital Group. I was still listed as a guarantor, but no longer as an owner. That meant risk without control. I drove to the Caldwell estate that night, sat in the car at the end of the driveway, and did nothing. I went home instead and scanned the documents again. Michael confirmed it the next day. The timing was precise. 2 days before Rachel filed. That was when I stopped hoping this would resolve quietly. I organized everything into folders. Bank activity, property records, emails. Each labeled, dated, cross-referenced. I practiced explaining it out loud in my kitchen, keeping my voice even, stripping away emotion until only facts remained. I knew if I ever raised my voice in court, it would be used against me. By the time the court date arrived, I had already accepted what the room would look like. I knew Thomas would be there. I knew he would smirk. I knew Rachel would play her role. What they did not know was how long I had been preparing for that exact posture. The judge returned to the bench, and the room quieted again. He had reviewed the documents. His face revealed nothing. Rachel's attorney stood and spoke about routine financial management within a marriage. He framed every transfer as standard practice. He implied I was confused by complexity I did not understand. I let him finish. When the judge asked if I wished to respond, I stood and thanked him. I kept my hands steady on the podium. I pointed out the timing of the transfers, not the amounts. I noted the proximity to legal consultations. I did not accuse. I asked questions. Questions are harder to object to. The attorney interrupted once, arguing relevance. The judge overruled him calmly. That was the first time I saw Thomas's confidence falter. Margaret leaned toward him, whispering urgently. Rachel shifted in her seat, her practiced stillness slipping just enough for me to notice. She had not expected this pace. She had expected me to be defensive. I was not. The judge requested additional documentation related to property ownership. I nodded and handed over the folder Michael and I had assembled weeks earlier. As the bailiff took it, I felt the familiar weight lift again. This was still preparation, still groundwork. While the judge reviewed the materials, the room filled with a low murmur. I caught fragments of conversation, strategy, explanations, damage control. I stayed silent. The judge announced that he would need time to consider the submissions and called for a short recess. People stood, stretched, whispered. Rachel's legal team clustered around her. Thomas spoke with sharp gestures now, no longer relaxed. I remained seated. Michael had told me once that people reveal themselves most clearly when they think they are still winning. Watching Thomas that day, I understood exactly what he meant. As the recess continued, I felt the calm I had carried for months settle even deeper. I knew what was coming next, and I knew they did not. This was still the surface, still the part they could argue, still the layer meant to draw attention away from what lay underneath. When the judge returned, he would expect more explanation, more argument, more noise. What he would not expect was how much further this story went, or how carefully I had chosen when to tell it. I folded my hands, waited for the signal to stand, and reminded myself that patience had brought me this far. The rest would depend on timing. When the judge returned to the bench, the room snapped back into order like a held breath finally released. People shuffled into their seats. Whispers cut short. Papers gathered close. Rachel's attorneys took their places with renewed focus. Their confidence still intact, but sharpened now, like men who realized the ground might not be as solid as they thought. Thomas Caldwell leaned back again. Though his posture had changed, his shoulders were tighter, his jaw set. Margaret sat closer to Rachel than before, one hand resting lightly on her daughter's arm, a silent reminder to stay composed. The judge looked down at the folder in front of him, then up at me. "Mr. Harper," he said, "you may continue." I stood and walked back to the podium. My shoes sounded louder than they had earlier, not because the room was quieter, but because people were listening now. I placed both hands on the wood, steadying myself, and glanced briefly at the papers laid out before me. I did not look at Rachel. I did not look at her parents. "Your Honor," I began, "the documents you have reviewed show the amounts and destinations of several transfers from our joint accounts. What they do not show at first glance is the timing." Rachel's attorney was already on his feet. "Objection. Relevance. These are marital funds. Timing alone does not establish misconduct." The judge held up a hand without looking at him. "Overruled. Continue, Mr. Harper." I nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and went on. I pointed out that each transfer occurred within days of a legal consultation retained by the petitioner. I did not say fraud. I did not say theft. I said alignment. I said sequence. I said pattern. As I spoke, I could feel the shift in the room. Not dramatic, not sudden, but unmistakable. The gallery leaned forward slightly. The clerk stopped typing for a moment, then resumed. Rachel's attorney scribbled notes faster than before. I moved to the next page, then the next, each one building on the last. No theatrics, no raised voice, just facts arranged carefully enough that they could not be ignored. When I finished that section, the judge nodded and made a note. He then turned to Rachel's attorney. "Counsel." The attorney stepped forward, adjusted his jacket, and launched into an explanation about financial management within marriage. He spoke smoothly, confidently, citing precedents and general practice. He gestured toward me once, briefly, as if to suggest I was simply overwhelmed by complexity. I listened without interruption. When he finished, the judge looked back at me. "Response?" I did not argue his points directly. I did not challenge his experience. I asked a single question. If these transfers were routine household management, why did they begin only after legal counsel was retained? And why were they directed to entities with no prior connection to our shared finances? The attorney opened his mouth, then closed it again. He tried another angle, speaking about flexibility in marital roles. The judge let him finish. then asked for documentation supporting that explanation. That was when I reached for the next folder. As I handed it to the bailiff, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Thomas Caldwell had leaned forward, whispering sharply to Margaret. She shook her head once, lips pressed tight. The bailiff passed the folder to the judge, who opened it slowly. Inside were property records, neatly organized, highlighted where necessary. I had practiced this part more than any other, Your Honor. I said, "These documents reflect a transfer of ownership for our residence in Plano." The transfer occurred 2 days before the divorce petition was filed. Rachel's attorney stood up again. "Objection. This is misleading. Property titles are often adjusted for tax planning and asset management." The judge did not look up as he spoke. "Sit down, counsel." The room went still. The judge flipped through the pages, eyes scanning line after line. His expression did not change, but his attention deepened. He paused on one page longer than the others. "This transfer," he said, "was made to an entity associated with Caldwell Capital Group." "That is correct, Your Honor." Thomas Caldwell stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. "This is absurd," he said. "That house was always meant to be protected. He has no understanding of how these things work." The judge looked up then, his gaze sharp. "Mr. Caldwell, you will sit down or you will be removed from this courtroom." Thomas hesitated, his face flushing, then lowered himself back into the chair with visible effort. Margaret leaned in, murmuring something urgently. Rachel stared straight ahead, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. I continued, my voice steady. "At the time of the transfer, I remained personally liable for the property. While my ownership interest was removed, this placed risk entirely on me, without corresponding control." That statement hung in the air. The judge made another note. He asked a few clarifying questions, precise and measured. I answered each one calmly. Rachel's attorney objected twice more, each time overruled. For the first time since the hearing began, the room no longer felt like it belonged to the Caldwell family. When the judge finally set the folder down, he looked up at both tables. "Based on the submissions before the court," he said, "there are sufficient questions regarding the handling of marital assets to warrant interim measures." Rachel's attorney stiffened. "Accordingly, the court orders a temporary freeze on the assets in dispute pending further review." Rachel sucked in a breath she could not stop. Thomas's hand tightened into a fist. Margaret's composed expression finally cracked, just for a second. The judge raised a hand again. "This is not a finding of wrongdoing," he said. "It is a procedural safeguard." He then announced a brief recess as people stood. The noise returned, louder this time, edged with urgency. Rachel's legal team immediately surrounded her. Thomas spoke in rapid, clipped sentences, his confidence clearly shaken. Margaret nodded along, eyes darting toward me and away again. I stayed where I was. I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, but I did not let it show. This was not the moment to savor anything. This was the moment to stay invisible. Michael's words echoed in my head. "Let them think this is the fight." I sat back down, my hands resting on the briefcase that now held fewer folders than it had that morning. The weight was changing, but not gone. Across the room, Rachel finally looked at me again. Her eyes searched my face, not for anger, not for resentment, but for understanding. I gave her none. This was the point where most people would stop, where they would assume the leverage gained was enough, where they would start negotiating. I did not come here to negotiate. As the judge left the bench and the bailiff called for order, I leaned back slightly and closed my eyes for a brief moment. What I had shown so far was real, undeniable, and dangerous for them. But it was still only the part of the story they expected me to have. The deeper truth was still in my briefcase, waiting for the moment when the room would be quiet enough to hear it. The recess did not calm anyone on the Caldwell side. It sharpened them. When the judge returned and called the room back to order, the air felt tighter than before. Rachel's attorneys had rearranged their papers, stacked higher now, like height alone could rebuild authority. Thomas Caldwell sat forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the bench. Margaret's hand never left Rachel's arm. Whatever reassurance she was whispering had lost its effect. The judge looked down at the docket, then back up. "Before we proceed further," he said, "I want clarification on the scope of these transfers and their intended purpose." Rachel's attorney rose immediately, voice firm, speaking about estate planning and asset protection. He framed the transfers as strategic, responsible, designed to safeguard family resources in uncertain times. He spoke as though this were common practice among people who understood wealth. The judge listened without interruption, then turned to me. "Mr. Harper." I stood again and felt something shift inside my chest. Not fear, not anger, recognition. This was the moment the masks stopped working. "Your Honor," I said, "I am not disputing the idea of planning. I am disputing the execution." I laid out the next set of documents, careful and methodical. Each page showed timing, sequence, consequence. I pointed to one transaction in particular, a movement of funds tied directly to Caldwell Capital Group that had no corresponding business activity, no invoices, no returns, just money leaving our account and settling somewhere it had never gone before. Rachel's attorney objected, arguing that not every investment generates immediate documentation. The judge allowed him to finish, then asked him to produce evidence that this investment existed beyond the transfer itself. Silence followed, not long, but long enough. I could feel Thomas Caldwell watching me now, not with amusement, but with calculation. His confidence had not vanished, but it was working harder to hold together. I moved to the next document. This one showed a series of internal communications between entities associated with Caldwell Capital Group. I did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. I simply explained that these communications referenced funds originating from our joint accounts, routed through temporary holding structures, then redistributed in ways that obscured their origin. Rachel's attorney tried to interrupt again. The judge raised a hand. "Let him finish," I finished. The judge leaned back in his chair and studied the page in front of him. He asked me where I had obtained the records. I answered honestly. Public filings, bank statements, documents I was authorized to access as a joint account holder. Thomas Caldwell stood again. "This is harassment," he said. Voice raised now, composure cracking. "He has no right to drag our family through this." The judge did not raise his voice. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "this court will determine what is relevant. You will remain seated." Thomas did not sit right away. For a moment, I thought he might push further. Then Margaret tugged at his sleeve, and he sank back down, face flushed, breathing hard. Rachel stared at the table in front of her. The careful posture from earlier had collapsed. Her shoulders were rigid, her jaw clenched. She did not look at me. The judge spoke again. "Based on what I have seen, there is sufficient cause to expand the scope of inquiry beyond routine marital accounting." Rachel's attorney stiffened. He asked for time to respond fully, to prepare additional explanations. The judge nodded. "That is reasonable. However, until this matter is resolved, the court maintains the freeze on the assets in question." A murmur rippled through the room. Not shock, recognition. I felt it too. Not triumph, not relief, momentum. The judge announced a continuation hearing would be scheduled after further review. He reminded all parties that attempts to move or conceal assets during this period would be viewed unfavorably. As the session adjourned for the day, the tension did not dissipate. It followed us into the hallway. Rachel's attorneys spoke in low, urgent voices, one of them gesturing sharply toward me before being pulled aside. Thomas paced near the exit, phone pressed to his ear, voice clipped, controlled only by force of habit. Margaret stood with Rachel, whispering, eyes darting. Rachel finally approached me. She stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to come closer. Her voice was low, strained. She asked why I was doing this. She said this was not necessary. She said we could resolve things privately. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her calmly that I was resolving things, just not the way she expected. She searched my face, trying to find the man she thought she knew. The tired businessman, the overwhelmed husband, the one who backed down to keep the peace. She did not find him. Thomas strode over then, anger barely contained. He spoke fast, sharp, accusing me of betrayal, of ingratitude, of misunderstanding how things worked. He said I was making a mistake I could not undo. I let him finish. Then I told him quietly that I understood exactly how things worked. That was why I was here. For the first time since I had known him, Thomas Caldwell did not have a response ready. Security stepped closer, sensing the shift. Margaret pulled him back, hissing something I could not hear. Rachel looked between us, fear replacing frustration. I gathered my briefcase and walked away. Outside, the afternoon sun was harsh, reflecting off the courthouse steps. Reporters were beginning to gather at a distance, tipped off by whispers and rumors. I did not stop. I did not look back. As I drove home, the adrenaline drained slowly, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. I thought about Emily, about the promise I had made to protect her future, even if it meant burning down my own reputation in the process. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the remaining folders spread out in front of me. The ones I had not shown. The ones Michael and I had debated holding back. I reviewed them again, not for content, but for timing. What I had put on the record that day was enough to change the tone, enough to unsettle, enough to force caution. It was not enough to finish anything. People like the Caldwells did not collapse from pressure alone. They adapted. They restructured. They looked for ways out. I knew that by the next hearing, they would come prepared. Explanations refined, stories polished, loopholes explored. I also knew something else. Everything they had built their confidence on assumed I would stop here. I closed the last folder and placed it back in the briefcase, separate from the rest. This one was thicker, heavier, and far more dangerous. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I understood that the next time I stood in that courtroom, the rules would be different. The surface fight was over. What came next would reach far beyond a divorce. And once it began, there would be no quiet way back. Once that door closed, I stopped thinking like a husband in a divorce and started thinking like a witness to something much larger. The next hearing came faster than I expected. The court moved with a different energy now, less routine, more alert. When I walked back into the Fort Worth courthouse, I noticed security standing closer to the doors. Not because of me, but because the room had changed. Word had traveled. Judges talk, clerks talk, and once financial irregularities cross a certain threshold, they stop being private. Rachel arrived with a tighter circle around her. Her attorneys looked sharper, more aggressive. Thomas Caldwell wore a confident expression again, but it felt forced, like a mask glued back on too quickly. Margaret had switched from reassurance to vigilance. She scanned the room the way people do when they expect something to go wrong. I sat alone as always. Same briefcase, same seat. But the weight inside it had shifted. When the judge called the session to order, he went straight to the point. He acknowledged the expanded scope of review and stated that additional material had been submitted for consideration. Then he looked at me and asked if I intended to introduce anything further. This was the moment Michael and I had debated for weeks. I stood slowly and said that I did. I said the material I wished to submit went beyond asset distribution and into matters relevant to the integrity of the financial representations already before the court. Rachel's attorney objected immediately. He argued relevance, jurisdiction, scope. He said this was a civil matter, not a fishing expedition. The judge listened, hands folded, then asked a simple question. He asked whether the documents related directly to funds already identified in the proceedings. I answered yes. The judge nodded and allowed me to proceed. I opened the final folder. The first thing I submitted was a set of transaction trails Michael had reconstructed. Not summaries, but raw data linked across entities. Funds leaving our joint accounts did not stop at Caldwell Capital Group. They moved again, and again, through companies that shared directors, addresses, and filing agents. Shells layered over shells. I did not label them as such. I let the structure speak for itself. The courtroom grew very quiet. Rachel's attorney approached the bench, voice low but urgent. He requested a sidebar. The judge shook his head and told him to speak on the record. That was when the attorney changed tactics. He argued that even if the transfers appeared complex, complexity alone did not imply illegality. Wealthy families used layered structures all the time. The judge agreed. Then he asked where the underlying business activity was. I turned the page. What followed were invoices that did not reconcile. Projects that existed on paper, but not in reality. Payments issued for services that never occurred. Transfers labeled as investments that produced no equity, no dividends, no documentation beyond the initial movement of funds. Thomas Caldwell stood up again. But this time he did not speak. He simply stood there, hands on the back of the chair, breathing heavier than before. The judge ordered him to sit. Margaret whispered something sharp in his ear. Rachel had gone completely still. The judge looked at the materials for a long time. Then he looked toward the side of the courtroom, where a woman had been sitting quietly since the beginning of the hearing. She wore a plain suit, no visible legal insignia, and had not spoken once. He asked her to come forward. Her name was Laura Nguyen, Assistant District Attorney for Tarrant County. When she stood, the room seemed to tilt. The judge explained that based on what he had reviewed, the court had concerns that extended beyond the immediate divorce proceedings. He said the materials suggested potential criminal conduct related to the movement and concealment of funds. He asked whether the district attorney's office wished to review the submissions. Laura Nguyen did not hesitate. She said yes. Rachel's attorney objected loudly. He argued that this was an ambush, that his clients were being denied due process. The judge cut him off. He said the court was not making a finding of guilt. He said the court was fulfilling its obligation to refer credible evidence where appropriate. Then he ordered an immediate judicial hold on all accounts and properties connected to the entities named in the documentation. I watched the color drain from Thomas Caldwell's face. Margaret reached for his arm, gripping it hard. Rachel's breath came shallow and fast, like she was trying not to panic in front of everyone. Laura Nguyen accepted the folder from the clerk and flipped through it with professional speed. Her expression did not betray shock or excitement, just focus. She looked up once and asked the judge to confirm that these records covered a span of several years. I answered that they did. She nodded and said her office would initiate a preliminary investigation immediately. She requested temporary custodial review of the primary individuals involved to prevent destruction of evidence. The judge granted the request. The sound that followed was not loud. It was a collective intake of breath. Thomas Caldwell protested. He said this was outrageous. He said he was a respected businessman. He said this was a misunderstanding. The judge warned him once. Rachel's attorney tried again. Voice strained now, asking for a stay, for time, for restraint. The judge denied each request calmly. Laura Nguyen turned and spoke to court officers, instructing them to escort Thomas and Margaret Caldwell to a separate room for processing pending further instruction. Margaret broke down then. Her composure finally shattered. She cried openly, clutching at Thomas's arm. demanding explanations that no one offered. Rachel did not move. She sat frozen, eyes fixed on the table in front of her, as if the surface might crack open if she looked up. When the officers approached her parents, she finally reacted, standing halfway before stopping herself. She looked at me, not with anger, not with hatred, with fear. I did not return the look, as Thomas Caldwell was led away, still protesting, still insisting on his standing. I felt no surge of victory, no satisfaction, only a deep, steady release, like something heavy finally set down. The judge called for order and explained that the divorce proceedings would be paused pending the outcome of the criminal review. He reminded everyone that this was not a verdict, but a process. The room slowly emptied. Reporters crowded the hallway now. Microphones appeared. Cameras flashed. I kept my head down and walked past them without a word. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, or maybe I was. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. My hands were steady. My thoughts were clear. This was the point of no return. What had begun as a quiet preparation had crossed into public consequence. There would be no resetting the board, no negotiating this away. As I drove home, I thought about Emily, about the life I wanted her to have, about the truth she would one day learn, whether from me or from headlines. Or the folder that had started all of this now sat in the custody of the state. The burden was no longer mine alone. But the story was not finished, not even close. The next chapter would not be about evidence or strategy. It would be about what happens when people who believe they are untouchable discover that the ground beneath them has finally given way. The fallout did not arrive all at once. It seeped into everything quietly, the way pressure changes before a storm. The days after the hearing blurred together. Phones rang constantly, numbers I did not recognize lighting up the screen. Messages piled up from people who had not spoken to me in years, some offering support, others fishing for information. I ignored most of them. I learned early that silence was still my safest position. Rachel did not call. Instead, her attorney sent a formal notice requesting temporary arrangements regarding Emily. The tone had changed completely. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the assumption of control. The language was careful now, measured, almost apologetic. The court granted me primary custody while the investigations proceeded. Rachel did not object. She did not have the ground to stand on anymore. When Emily came to stay with me full time, she asked why things felt different. I told her the truth in the only way a father can. I said that sometimes adults make choices that have consequences, and that none of this was her fault. She nodded like she understood, even if she could not fully grasp it yet. At night, after she fell asleep, I sat alone in the quiet house and listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock. The noise inside my head had finally gone silent, not because things were resolved, but because I was no longer guessing what would happen next. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Laura and Gwen's office requested additional records. Michael Reeves was contacted directly. He called me one evening, his voice low but steady, and told me the scope was expanding. "They are pulling years now," he said. "Not just your accounts." That did not surprise me. Thomas Caldwell had built his empire on layers. Layers protect you when people look from the outside. They collapse when someone starts pulling from the center. Margaret Caldwell was released later that night. Thomas was not. The news reported it as a procedural matter. No charges yet. Just questions. Just concerns. The media filled in the rest. Headlines talked about a prominent investment family under review. Phrases like alleged irregularities and potential misconduct appeared everywhere. No one mentioned my name directly at first, but the connection was obvious. Rachel finally reached out a week later. She asked if we could talk. Not about the case, she said. About Emily. We met at a small park halfway between our houses. She looked smaller somehow, like the confidence she once wore had been peeled away layer by layer. She tried to explain herself. She said she had trusted her parents. She said she never thought it would go this far. I listened. Then I told her that believing something would not go far did not stop it from moving once it did. She cried. Not the controlled tears from the courtroom, but the kind that leave you hollow. I felt no anger toward her in that moment, just distance, a recognition that the person I had married no longer existed, if she ever had. She asked if I could help her parents, if I could speak to the prosecutor. She reminded me of holidays, of family dinners, of the past. I told her the truth. I no longer had that power. And even if I did, it was not mine to use. That was the last conversation we had. My business limped forward slowly. Harper Freight Solutions did not bounce back overnight. Contracts were cautious. Credit was tight. But the rumors had shifted. Where once people whispered about collapse, now they whispered about survival. Kevin Brooks called me one afternoon. He apologized. He said he should have trusted me. He asked if I wanted to talk about rebuilding. I told him maybe, not yet. I had learned that rushing back into old rhythms was how mistakes repeated themselves. Thomas Caldwell was formally charged 3 weeks later. Financial fraud, misrepresentation, conspiracy to conceal assets. Margaret was named as a co-conspirator. Rachel was listed as a cooperating witness. Seeing it in print did not bring satisfaction. It brought finality. The courthouse that had once echoed with laughter now echoed with reporters. I avoided it as much as I could. When I did have to appear, I kept my head down and my answers brief. One evening, after Emily had gone to bed, I stood on the back porch and watched the sky darken. The air smelled like rain. I thought about how much energy I had spent trying to be accepted by people who had already decided my place. I thought about how close I had come to losing everything by staying quiet for the wrong reasons. Justice, I learned, is not a moment. It is a process that unfolds slowly, often without drama, often without applause. Karma does not announce itself. It arrives when it is ready. The Caldwells would face years of questions, depositions, courtrooms that did not belong to them, the kind of scrutiny they had never imagined applied to themselves. But nothing felt finished yet. The investigation was ongoing. Charges were still evolving. Outcomes were uncertain. There were no guarantees, only forward motion. I tucked Emily in that night and sat beside her until her breathing evened out. She clutched her stuffed bear and rolled onto her side, trusting the world in a way only children can. That trust was why I had stayed silent for so long, and why I would never be silent again when it mattered. As I turned off the light and closed her door, I realized something simple. What had started as a fight for fairness had become a line I would never cross back over. The consequences were still unfolding, and the final chapter had not yet been written. Time did what courtrooms never can. It settled the dust without asking anyone for permission. Months passed. Not in dramatic leaps, but in small, quiet adjustments. The investigation continued. Headlines came and went, and the world moved on to the next story. I stopped reading most of it, not because it did not matter, but because it no longer defined my days. Emily and I moved out of Plano before winter set in. Not far, just east. Closer to a lake where the houses sat farther apart and people waved because they recognized you, not because they were curious. The place was smaller, older. It creaked at night when the temperature dropped. It felt honest. I downsized Harper Freight Solutions the same way. Fewer contracts, shorter routes, clients I could look in the eye. It was not the empire Thomas Caldwell used to boast about at dinner parties, but it was mine. Clean and manageable. For the first time in years, I slept without a phone buzzing beside the bed. Rachel faded into the background of my life, the way some chapters do. Still there, still real, but no longer central. She complied with custody arrangements. She stopped trying to explain herself. We spoke only when it involved Emily, and even then, the conversations were brief and careful. The trial came quietly. No grand spectacle, no movie moments, just testimony, documents, timelines. Thomas Caldwell sat at a table that did not belong to him anymore, his posture unfamiliar in a room where influence meant nothing. Margaret sat beside him, smaller than I remembered, hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor. Rachel testified for the prosecution. She looked tired, older. I did not feel satisfaction watching her speak, only a dull ache for the version of our life that never really existed. When the verdicts came, they landed without noise. Guilty on multiple counts. Years, not months. Fines that erased decades of accumulation. Restitution orders that put back what could be put back. I was not there when the judge read the sentences. I was at home, helping Emily with homework at the kitchen table. My phone buzzed once with a message from Michael Reeves. It said it was over. I stared at the screen for a long time before setting it face down. Emily asked me why I looked different. I told her sometimes things end quietly, even when they start loud. She accepted that and went back to her math problems. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat on the porch and listened to the water lap against the shore. I thought about how much of my life I had spent trying to be understood by people who were never interested in understanding me. I thought about the courtroom laughter, how small it sounded now, how temporary. I did not feel victorious. I felt free. Freedom is not loud. It does not announce itself. It shows up in ordinary moments, in the ability to make decisions without fear, in the absence of someone else steering your life while pretending to help. I still carry the lessons. I trust slower. I verify more. I do not confuse confidence with character anymore. Those scars stay with you, but they do not have to define you. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not hiring a lawyer that day. I tell them no. Not because lawyers are unnecessary, but because I needed to speak for myself in that moment. I needed the judge to hear my voice, not someone else's interpretation of it. Representing myself was never about pride. It was about ownership. The truth is, the moment they laughed was the moment they lost. Not because it angered me, but because it revealed exactly how much they underestimated the quiet work I had already done. If there is one thing I hope anyone watching this takes away, it is this. Being underestimated is not a weakness. It is an opportunity. Silence is not surrender. It is preparation. Justice does not always come fast, and it rarely comes clean. But it comes more often than people think when someone is willing to be patient and honest at the same time. Emily ran out onto the porch then, wrapped in a blanket, asking if I was coming inside. I picked her up and felt the simple weight of her in my arms, the only thing that had truly mattered through all of it. As I carried her back inside, I realized something else. The best revenge was not watching anyone fall. It was waking up each day knowing no one else held the pen to my life anymore. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever been laughed at, underestimated, or pushed aside, I would like to know. Share your thoughts. Stay with the channel, and remember that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who has already done the most work.